I'm Oleksandr Kravchuk. I'm the co-editor of the Commons channel, and today we're continuing our conference dedicated to fair, just renewal, and we're talking first of all about energy questions and the environment. So a few technical remarks first. People who joined us on Zoom, you can choose the channel you need, English or Ukrainian. Our speakers, a big request, please try to speak slowly in order to establish good conditions for interpretation. And then if our listeners have any kind of questions, please post them into comments and we'll ask them later. So the general framework that the moderator is supposed to introduce at the start of the discussion is an easy thing for me to do because 1/3 of all energy units, the infrastructure, and this has been damaged by Ukrainian shelling and missile strikes. So we have this schedule of blackouts in Ukraine. And against this backdrop, we talk about the energetic sector of Ukraine today and how this energy sector should function after the war, how we could change the Ukrainian and the world energy system, how we can lessen our dependencies on those corporations and countries that today rely on fossil fuels. Of course, Russia is one of them. So how do we decrease our dependency as the countries of the global south from the core countries in order for us to be able during the green transition to just pay for the green new solutions or introduce perhaps some carbon tax. And of course, we are going to also talk about the oil and gas dependencies that many countries have from Russia. This is something that is true in Ukraine and in Europe in general. Let me also introduce our panelists. We have many interesting experts with us today. They are Maryna Larina. She is a researcher in climate change and climate politics. Simon Pirani, a historian from Britain, a researcher in the energy sphere, a writer, a socialist writer. We also have Leszek Karlik with us. He is a climate activist from Poland and also a member of the energy policy group of the Polish party Razem together. And then we also have with us Christian Zeller, professor of economic geography in Salzburg, and he is also looking into the question of energy and economy alternatives. So let's probably start. And the floor is given first of all to Maryna Larina. She is the author of many publications published in Ukrainian in the Commons Journal, in particular on the green and just transition, meaning the kind of transition that takes into account the interests of people receiving, consuming the energy. And I will ask her to talk about the energy transition and how Ukraine today is being part of the general European trend, the Green Deal, the European New Green Deal, and which perhaps problems this gives us. So Maryna, the floor is yours. Thank you for your invitation. Today I would most like to focus on the future and to look at how the reconstruction of Ukraine, post-war reconstruction, new green reconstruction of Ukraine could take place. It's interesting to note that based on my experience, so I'm in Germany now and have been here for quite some time on permanent basis. So I'm watching all the discussions about Ukraine and the war. And this is what I noticed recently. The topic of post-war reconstruction of Ukraine is actually being quite widely discussed in press, in media, from the political perspective, from the point of view of certain European politicians and states, and then in the public sector, different kinds of organizations like humanitarian aid organizations are also talking about these issues. But I noticed that these discussions are basically absent among the European left. I mean, the discussions to do with Ukraine basically are centered on the weapons, for example, or sanctions against Russia, but it's a pity that when Ukraine is being discussed, people are not talking about the future, about the prospects of finding some common ground, finding topics where people would not really, when we talk about ordinary citizens, feel helpless. So talking about the damage incurred by the war, talking about stopping all of this in order to empower people, to make them feel that they're not passive and they're not helpless in this situation. Generally, why do I want to talk about the European Union today and the dynamics of relationships between the EU and Ukraine? Why is this important? An important question for the green reconstruction after the war? Well, obviously, the European Union plays a very, and has been playing a very important role even before the war, because Ukraine signed this association agreement and is now going to slowly go towards becoming a member of the European Union. And generally, the EU will obviously play an important role in the post-war rebuilding of Ukraine. Of course, there are many other actors apart from that, international organizations, the United States of America, etc. But the EU in particular and the direction of our movement chosen by Ukraine, I would say that it will play a very important role in what we got in the post-war period, what kind of reconstruction happens, how it happens, and so on. Also, the relevance comes from the fact that from the point of view of our economic activity on the international level, the export has been 39 or 40%. If we look at the exports from Ukraine into the European Union, so European Union is the main direction of export for us right now, because of the blockade of the seaports and so on. The EU is becoming more and more important for Ukraine in terms of exporting goods. So I would say that there are many different definitions when it comes to reconstruction, green reconstruction, and so on. Basically, what underlines the green reconstruction as a concept is the idea of rebuilding based on the economic model, based on low carbon principles. Many people think that this is greatly related to the European New Green Deal and the program to reach net zero emissions and carbon neutrality until 2015, the program which is targeting the carbon emissions in energy, in the energy sector, in different industries, and only on the level of, for example, cars and houses, everyday use of energy. So generally, we notice that when people look at the question of the new Green Deal, it's becoming a very widely discussed and topical issue. Pressure is growing within the United European community. There are discussions between different member states, and then there is a lot of pressure on those countries that have signed the association agreements or are on the way to become the members. So the climate perspective, the focus on this Green Deal is growing in terms of the EU's relationship with other countries, not just its members. And then the test phase of the carbon correction mechanism is starting being implemented. This will become something that all the importers working with the EU will also be influenced by. So it's this kind of carbon tax, basically, which will be measured according to the carbon price in EU. A great request for this speaker to start maybe speaking more slowly if possible. So the carbon tax would be measured and established based on the CO2 price in the European Union today. It fluctuates between approximately 60 and 80 euro, and the peak was 98 euro in August. So this will be implemented in approximately 5 industries that are very that consume a lot of energy, like iron, steel, aluminum, fertilizers, the energy sector, and so on. If we look at the export between Ukraine and the EU recently, then we can see that these spheres actually in some other industries, like, for example, minerals and so on, basically this part has amounted to approximately 40% of the general export from Ukraine to the European Union, which means that these industries, these sectors are very important, quite important for Ukrainian export, and they will be taxed, so to speak, on the side of the EU. So European producers, manufacturers will have to pay this kind of carbon tax to buy the certificates from the European Union in order to be able to export their goods from Ukraine to the EU. Why, from a different perspective, is this also important? Because Ukraine has suffered from a lot of damage. There is no clear assessment on all of the damage, including the damage to the environment. But anyway, it's clear that Oleksandr mentioned this at the start, the alternative energy infrastructure, and also if we look at some particular industries like the iron and steel industry, which amounts to a great part of Ukrainian export, these sectors suffered from enormous damage, like the Mariupol Ilyich iron and steel works, for example. This amounted to basically the 40% of Ukrainian iron steel production. So it's clear that on the one hand, we have the regulatory pressures from the outside on Ukraine, and on the other hand, we have this momentum, this window of opportunity for Ukraine because of those regulatory requirements to make a step into a different direction from the direction it has been going in. So what do we understand as a green reconstruction? I would say that in Ukraine, the vision is not particularly clear. When people in Ukraine discuss this, the authorities, we are talking about POCs, for example, or expanding the territories, spaces, green spaces. So there is this unclear understanding of what simplified understanding of what climate policy could be, the Green Deal policy could be. If we look at what the EU, the European Union is saying when it talks about the green reconstruction, then we clearly understand that there are some interests that the European Union would like to pursue. There are some priorities for them in this sphere, and it's clear that the European Union would be interested for Ukraine to also pursue those directions. So we're talking about the rebuilding of infrastructure and roads and houses, generally without any clear tie to the green reconstruction, which is something that is necessary. We have to do this in Ukraine, but on the other hand, in the context of green reconstruction, we are talking about the reconstruction of the energy sector, but also about expanding the use of renewable sources of energy in Ukraine. There are many studies right now saying that Ukraine has this great space that it could use, which is not right now being used for wind farms and solar farms, which is right now done in the European Union, and so on. So clearly we see that there is this interest into expanding the renewable energy sector in Ukraine and then exporting the energy to the European Union. After the start of the full-scale war, Ukraine became part of the NSOE, the electric grid system in the European Union, and started supplying electricity to the European Union, and the trade capacities have actually been growing during the recent month, but after the missile attacks from Russia in October, Ukraine temporarily stopped supplying electricity to the European Union because of the great damage that Ukrainian energy infrastructure incurred. And if we look at all the priorities in the European Union in terms of green reconstruction, then hydrogen is the so-called green hydrogen is one of the top priorities for the European Union. So we mean the hydrogen produced based on renewable energy sources and then exported into the European Union. Before the war, Ukraine has played an important part in this strategy for the European Union. Generally, this priority is important in terms of European Union's cooperation with countries of Eastern Partnership, North Africa, like Morocco, for example. Even after the start of the war, Ukraine, even after the start of the war, we're talking about this direction of development because we're pursuing the independence from Russia, Russian oil and gas. And so we're talking about Europe also not being dependent on the fossil fuel export from Russia. So in the context of Ukraine, the production of this green hydrogen is seen as very important. This was a point discussed during the Lugano conference in terms of Ukraine's reconstruction after the war. So a lot of attention is paid to green hydrogen, perhaps more attention than this deserves. If we generally look at the situation in Ukraine, the current situation. But anyway, this is a priority, and this is how the green reconstruction is seen in the EU. What do we need for reconstruction apart from these things? Without regarding the vision of the European Union or Ukrainian government, generalizing what we need, first of all, this is financing. We need assessment, of course, and current assessment is quite different. According to the World Bank, we're talking about 350 billions. According to other sources, we need more than 1 trillion euro, etc. So while the war is ongoing, there is no clear and final assessment, and of course the damage is still being done. Anyway, the financing, the funds we're talking about, this should be based on grant funds because the external debt is growing, the national debt is growing, and the loans will not help towards just green reconstruction in Ukraine in the interest of the people of Ukraine. The energy sector, we need to focus on the renewable sources of energy, and they will play a significant role in Ukraine's independence and decarbonization. But this is not something that we need to think about only in terms of export. We also need to think about how Ukraine could rely on those sources for its own needs. The question of housing is very important. Do we build a lot of housing right now? And this is something that we can do quicker and cheaper, or do we build houses more slowly, but they would be more modern in terms of, for example, energy efficiency and so on. There are a lot of discussions about that, but anyway, we understand that the construction sector is also important for many, for a great number of emissions. So we could and should think how reconstruction of all damaged houses or construction of new ones could be conducted. So, for example, the National Fund of Energy Efficiency started this pilot project on building 60 houses based on great funds in Kyiv, Sumy, Zhytomyr, and Chernihiv regions. And the grant money we have right now for this is 5 million euro, which is not enough to finish this project and also to scale it in all of Ukraine. And then there is the sphere of transport. The European Union and Ukrainian government alike are not very keen to talk about the railway networks development. This is something that is mentioned, but not a priority for some reason. But we do see that the railways played and continue to play an important part in Ukraine during the war. In terms of evacuation, for example, the railway infrastructure which we have in Ukraine makes it very logical to expand the railway network in Ukraine to modernize it. And the European Union has also some problems with railways, not to the scale we have in Ukraine. So if we look at Germany, for example, their situation is quite similar to to our Ukrainian situation, with railway networks being decreased, being cut. If we look at the 90s and look at now, we can see clearly that the development and railway networks is not a priority in the European Union, as well as in Ukraine. So it's important to take this into account while making plans for reconstruction. It's not just about energy efficiency and climate, for example, efficiency and climate protection. We also need to think about labor standards and how they should be implemented in Ukraine, because Ukraine, after all, is on its way to become the member of the European Union. Thank you. And this is the end of my speech. I'd like our speakers to pay attention to the time limit, but it's a very interesting speech. Anyway, there are different ways to become integrated into the European community, obviously, and that all depends on the political will which exists in a certain country, the political will of the Ukrainian leadership. So I hope that the movement to the European Green New Deal will also take into account Ukrainian interests. And I would like to give the floor to Simon Pirani, who is also a great defender of Ukraine and Ukrainian resistance. We have been publishing his articles also on the pages of our journal, and we would ask Simon to talk in detail about the requirements, what has to be paid attention to by progressive movements both in Ukraine and abroad when we talk about the fight against dependency, tackling the dependency from Russia in terms of resources. Simon, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alexander. Before I start, I want to say I have not visited Ukraine since the invasion in February, and I only understand the difficulties that you started off with, particularly in the last week with the bombing of the power stations and other infrastructure. I only understand those difficulties at second hand. And I think it's very difficult to talk about post-war reconstruction while the war is raging as it is now. But that discussion has started. It started at government level at the Lugano conference between the Ukrainian government and the European governments. And in my view, the labor movement and social movements need an approach that takes the side of working people, that takes the side of society as opposed to economic and political elites. So I'll just highlight 4 principles that I think can help to develop such an approach. The first principle is that energy should be supplied mainly from renewable sources. Maryna has spoken about this. Society internationally needs an energy transition to a system without fossil fuels. That means it will have to be centered on electricity networks with the electricity generated from sources such as solar, wind, and wave power. That applies internationally, and it applies because of global heating. And I'm sure everybody who's listening today understands that. I just want to underline that for the last 30 years, the world's most powerful governments have gone to great lengths to delay this energy transition, while at the same time pretending to deal with the problem. So the labor movement and social movements need to advocate a transition that serves our interests, that serves the interests of society and not the interests of capital. 2 points about Ukraine specifically. The first is about coal. And as we all know, the Donbass was built on coal. The use of coal has already been falling since 2016, mainly due to Russian aggression. But now there is a discussion in the Donbass, I think it's very welcome, about a future without coal. There's an open letter by the mayors of Mirnograd, Chervonograd, and other towns. And I think as the labor movement, we should engage with that discussion. Second, about gas. The government has actually sought to reduce dependence on Russian gas, and there have been no direct imports since 2015. But in Ukraine, as elsewhere, gas companies make the false argument that gas is part of the solution to the problem of greenhouse gas emissions because you get more energy with fewer emissions than coal. But actually, gas is part of the problem. The energy transition means moving away from gas. And in Ukraine, that's a tough task. The second principle is that it's in society's interest to cut the flow of energy through technological systems. To understand this, we should first forget the idea of energy demand. People do not want energy. They want things that energy provides. They want heat, they want light, electricity to run their computers, the ability to travel, and so on. And these things can be provided using far less energy than is used now by making better use of technologies that have already existed for decades. An obvious example is heat from people's homes. In Ukraine, this comes mainly from gas boilers or district heating systems. This is a problem that we can start tackling now. The first thing is that homes can be insulated. The second thing is that electric heat pumps can replace gas boilers. This would keep people warm, which is what those people want, but it would cut greenhouse gas emissions. These technologies are pretty simple, even though retrofitting them to old buildings can be tricky. Now, these are short-term measures, but we should link these with longer-term measures, and here the creation of integrated urban energy systems is a priority. In such systems, you have multiple inputs of renewable energy, and these are integrated with energy storage facilities. The final point is that I think it's very good that some environmentalist organizations in Ukraine have advanced the idea just this year of what they call energy freedom, which they define as, quote, this is their words, the greatest possible freedom for citizens, organizations, and communities to produce energy and manage it in their own economies, unquote. I think that is a discussion also that we in the labor movement should participate in. What does that mean in practice? Community energy as opposed to energy controlled by and provided by the state. The third principle is that we should demand that fuels and electricity are treated as services, as rights for all, not as commodities. This is a long-standing principle of the European labor movement going back for many decades. And this must be our starting point in the question of how energy is provided to households, as a right, not as a commodity. The fourth point is that we should favor technologies that are compatible with our aims of social justice, and we should resist technologies that serve the state and capital. the EU's Green New Deal has been mentioned by Maryna. In my view, the EU is preparing for a limited shift to renewable energy supply, but a shift that protects powerful energy corporations and liberalized markets. Many Ukrainian politicians are happy with this political framework and the technological choices it implies, but I think we should not be happy with it. For example, the proposal that Maryna mentioned to produce electricity from renewable energy in Ukraine and export it. From Ukraine's point of view, this would be crazy. There are no benefits to Ukraine from this proposal. At the Lugano conference, there was talk of spending billions and billions of euros to do this. The renewable energy, solar and wind, which should be produced in Ukraine, and there is great potential for this, should be used to supply Ukraine's own electricity, to replace gas and coal. To produce it for hydrogen for export would be a form of neo-colonialism. Another live political issue is whether new nuclear plants should be built, specifically Khmelnytsky 3 and Khmelnytsky 4. This is in the interests of some Ukrainian politicians, but it is not in the interests of society. It is feasible to aim for a system that provides electricity that Ukraine needs from renewable sources without nuclear. So if money, if again, billions of euros is put into Khmelnytsky 3 and Khmelnytsky 4, this will not be going into other alternatives which are better from a social point of view. Now, of course, behind this, there are broader arguments about whether and how nuclear power should be part of post-fossil fuel energy systems at all. I am not enthusiastic about it because it is by nature bound up with powerful state and military structures. By contrast, decentralized renewable technologies, which is what all the engineers in the electricity industry today are discussing and researching, those decentralized renewable technologies are by their nature compatible with collective egalitarian ways of organizing society. That is socialist ways of organizing society. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Дякую, Саймоне. Я сподіваюся, у нас зараз буде ще дискусія стосовно атомної енергетики.
Thank you, Simon. I expect a discussion about nuclear energy today as well, because we have various representatives today who represent various approaches. As for your demands, you have 4 demands. Yes, I appreciate them. They're quite radical, but the thing is, this movement of subjects, it hasn't been created as of yet in Ukraine. It wasn't well established. That's why we mostly hope to get some pressure from abroad, from the organizations that can install these demands, can speak on international level as of energy policy in Ukraine. So I think that the next speaker, Leszek Karlik, it's great that he's next to speak. He has been dealing with energy questions for quite a long time. He will be speaking about a thing not quite so popular, about nuclear energy and the way it can be safe assistance in energy transition to energy independence. So, Leszek, the floor is yours. And please stick to the agenda, to the schedule. And guys, keep on writing your comments on Facebook and in Zoom chat. We'll speak. Okay, Leszek, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I have shared the screen. Can you see it? Okay, so dziękuję. I will be speaking about nuclear energy and renewable energy today. This is electrical synchronous grid shown here on this map. Sorry. Zoom has, okay. Zoom has decided to show photos of people over my controls, sorry. Electrical synchronous grids, which are presented here on this map, are the largest machines ever built by mankind, and they're a triumph of collective action on a continent-wide scale. Incidentally, this map here is not current because soon after the full-scale Russian invasion, Ukrainian grid operators have managed to successfully synchronize Ukrainian grid with European NSOE, which is an heroic feat that would normally take years of careful work. Unfortunately, electricity worldwide is still generated mostly from fossil fuels, and as we can see here, the situation is not changing rapidly. And we needed to change rapidly in order to avoid a global catastrophe that will last for many centuries, because unlike most graphs, global heating will continue past 2100. Europe is relatively advanced in decarbonization. Over half of our electricity is non-fossil, and nuclear was the largest single low-carbon source in 2019, before the pandemic. Then the energy use got a bit wonky, so I'm using statistics from 2019. Ukraine has a very advanced nuclear power sector. Before the full-scale invasion, over half its electricity came from nuclear, and the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, which is now occupied by Russian invaders and shut down, is the largest nuclear plant in Europe. Still, 1/4 of Ukrainian electricity before the war came from coal. And after Ukraine wins and starts rebuilding its economy, it will need to build a clean and low emissions energy grid. This will give rise to discussions. Do we want to rapidly build our renewables only? And do we want to shut down nuclear power plants as dangerous? Or do we want to build more nuclear power plants and not build any renewables? Renewables make sense, as you can see on this screen. Solar, wind, are getting cheaper and cheaper with each year. Although now with the global supply chain disruptions and China being on the fence in the conflict between Ukraine and Western democracies on one side and Russia's fascist regime on the other, the costs may unfortunately go back up or just stop dropping as rapidly. But wind and solar, even with low costs, have the problem of intermittency, because interseasonal storage, electricity storage, does not exist yet. And at our latitudes, there's a more than 10-fold difference in the amount of electricity generated on a best sunny spring day. This is this red curve here, and the amount of electricity generated on a worst dark January day, which is this blue curve in the bottom. The situation is completely different in countries like in Africa, because they are much more closer to the equator. We don't have interseasonal energy storage, and we will not have grid-scale storage facilities for at least 2 decades, because they're very slow to implement on large scale. And while on the average, winds are slightly stronger in the winter months, this is only an average. And continent-wide, week-long periods of low winds during winter still occur. So we need a complement, and a nuclear power would be a perfect complement to a low energy grid. You can look on Google Scholar for papers on hybrid nuclear renewables grids if you're interested, because despite what some opponents are saying, modern nuclear plants are perfectly capable of load following. This is a diagram of French nuclear production during the pandemic, when it had to load follow wind production. And we need all the tools in the toolbox to decarbonize, because while it is easy to build a single wind turbine or install one solar farm, grid-scale deployments of massive renewable energy installations are not fast enough and still fail to match the rate of decarbonization of historical nuclear deployments in Sweden or France or Finland. And decarbonization of electricity so far needs firm power sources, ones that are available on demand, whether it's nuclear or hydro or geothermal. And hydro is extremely dangerous, as we can see now with the war. So what about the problems of nuclear? Because of course there are problems. Every energy source has its problems. The biggest problem really is cost, but the cost of nuclear is driven by the cost of capital. And in case of Ukraine, nuclear that has been already built is extremely cheap to operate. What Ukraine will need is money for lifetime extensions, because we now know that pressurized water reactors, and Ukraine now operates only PWRs, can have their life extended for 6 and maybe even 8 decades. But the biggest perceived problems are the risk of accidents and radiation leaks and the issue of nuclear waste. The risk of another Chernobyl was one of the factors that helped the anti-war and anti-nuclear weapons pro-environmental movements stop the expansion of nuclear power in the 1980s and 1990s. The other being, of course, dark money and ads from fossil fuel companies. For example, these 3 leaflets that I'm showing are from American Petroleum Institute, Oil Heat Institute, and Australian coal miner unions. But the facts are well known now. Modern nuclear power is extremely safe per unit of energy generated. Basically, we're too far afraid of radiation risks and not afraid enough of air pollution, which according to latest research kills at least 9 million people a year globally. And yes, Chernobyl was a terrible accident, but a brown coal power plant over its lifetime will kill many, many more people than Chernobyl did. It will do so with air pollution. We're just very, very used to people dying of lung cancer caused by breathing in smoke. Homo sapiens is not good at assessing abstract risks because it was not an evolutionary requirement. And we have solutions for nuclear waste too. We can store it in long-term depositories like Onkalo in Finland. And when we build 4th generation nuclear power plants later in this century, we can use nuclear waste, that is spent nuclear fuel, as fuel again. Technological solutions have existed for a long time, but their implementations has been blocked by anti-nuclear power political movements, so that they can point at nuclear waste and say this issue has not been solved yet. For example, if we look at the history of Yucca Mountain in the US. And the most dangerous nuclear waste comes from nuclear weapons programs. Do we want a world without nuclear weapons? Certainly we do. But do we want a world where the Western democracies have no nuclear weapons because they democratically decided to get rid of them? But Putin's Russia does have nuclear weapons? Certainly not. I mean, anti-war activists had their hearts in the right places, but imagine a world where France and UK and the US had no nuclear weapons, or well, the US empire wouldn't get rid of its nukes, but let's say it's ruled by another Trump, an isolationist who doesn't care about Ukraine. So imagine Putin advancing on Kiev and saying that any stiff resistance will be met with tactical nukes, and if Europe starts helping too much, it will get nuked too. We live in a world with nuclear weapons, unfortunately, and have to deal with that reality. So they will be here with us for decades and a lot of nuclear waste too. So we have to somehow manage it. And one final thing concerning waste. The only accident with civilian nuclear waste that killed humans occurred with medical waste, a cesium chloride radiotherapy source in Goiânia in Brazil. But I never in my life saw Greenpeace picketing an oncology ward and demanding we stop treating cancer with radioactivity since we now have chemotherapy. Nuclear power doesn't treat cancer, but it actually prevents cancer by displacing fossil fuels and reducing air pollution. And we have to keep in mind that every nuclear power plant that operates now in Europe reduces the demand for fossil fuels from despots like either Vladimir Putin or Mohammed bin Salman. In March of this year, an environmental NGO called Replanet has created a Switch of Putin social media campaign showing how to stop importing Russian gas and how to basically reversing nuclear phase-outs in Germany, Sweden, and Belgium was a part of this plan because it reduces gas demand. So When Ukraine rebuilds, we need to keep nuclear on, and we need to build both renewables and nuclear. And what we really need to demand is for West to aid Ukraine in its rebuilding effort by financing both kinds of investments. Because in modern day, getting money is relatively easy. What really restricts our ability to stop emitting greenhouse gases are supply chains and physical resources, such as uranium, steel, and concrete on one hand for nuclear, and rare earth metals, lithium, cobalt, and copper on the other hand for renewables. So we really need both, because supply chains and resource demands of nuclear power do not have a significant overlap with supply chains and resource demands of renewables. So, dziękuję.
Дякую, Лешек. Справді складно говорити про...
Thank you, Leszek. Yes, it's difficult to talk about the development of nuclear energy sector in Ukraine, because for me personally and for my generation, we are all affected by Chernobyl. My father was one of the people, the emergency responder to the Chernobyl catastrophe, but at the same time, I understand that today the nuclear energy is the last barrier today, which prevents Ukrainian energy sector from completely being destroyed. But on the other hand, we are clearly in need of new technologies and looking into different alternatives, like, for example, combining the nuclear energy with the renewable energy resources in order to diversify energy supply, to make it safe and to make it affordable and also environmentally friendly. I understand that this is a controversial, perhaps, opinion, something that is open to discussions. Maybe we'll talk about that later. So Leszek, thank you. And Christian Zeller now has the place. He is a professor of economic geography from Salzburg. We would like to invite him to talk about this global perspective, about the issues faced today by eco-social activists around the world. So how can we think the world without its dependency on Russia and fossil fuel in general? Seeing this fossil fuel model as something of the past, which is no longer topical. So Christian, the floor is yours.
Good. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to have an exchange with you and bringing together quite different perspectives and even also quite different suggestions. My starting point is a little bit different from just the previously presented starting points, but I will be trying. I just have prepared a presentation. Just a moment. You see it? Okay, my starting point is just a moment. Yeah. Okay, I will combine 3 points. Some general challenges. I make it very broad. That this gives me the opportunity to trying to design a quite radical answer. Then I will make some remarks to current energy struggles, mostly focused on Germany, because this is a quite important political issue. And then I make some suggestions on an eco-socialist orientation. My starting point is the following. The main demand of the climate movement to limit global warming on 1.5 or at least 2 degrees, or even a little bit more, can only be realized if a radical industrial conversion and even dismantling programs are implemented in the most important capitalist or early industrialized countries however, including, of course, China and Russia. Of course, this is not achievable under the given power relations and without breaking with the capitalist logic of profit, of competition, of accumulation and growth. The big corporations, so the big fossil corporations, they will not be willing to let the capital linked to fossil fuels and all subsequent industries to be devalued. So this is a major contradiction, and this contradiction is not solvable. It's an antagonistic contradiction. What's the broader context? And this, I think we are in a very special period, in a unique historical period that combines different crises. Sorry, someone was calling me. We have a broad economic crisis. So all ingredients that provoked the financial crisis 2008, 9, and 10 subsequent years, they are all still here. Nothing has been fundamentally resolved of the economic crisis. And the crisis we are faced now already started basically before the pandemic began. The pandemic increased the crisis, and now in the current situation with war, and so we will face, it's highly likely that we face a new step, a recession or even a deep crisis. But this is in the context of a major crisis of our entire social metabolism with nature. And this, of course, is linked to the question of the Anthropocene. So we are in a stage of the Earth history that we left or are leaving, we are left the stable conditions of the Holocene of 11,000 years. And the Holocene, the configuration of the Holocene enabled us all civilizations we know, from the Neolithic revolution until the nuclear power station period. But that's gone. This stable configuration is gone. And now we are in a very unique situation that the conditions of the Earth system, the dynamics of the Earth system, the physical environment is changing within one generation. All previous generations had stable environmental conditions, at least on one generation. Now we face a situation that the Earth system is changing almost more quickly, faster than the societies are able to learn. That's a major problem. And we've also faced, I think, some kind of leadership crisis among the capitalist ruling classes. All kinds of problems that come together, they are so broad that they do not find real solutions. This leads to increasing geopolitical rivalries and tensions, war for power markets, even wars for resources and ecological things. And this is combined with the crisis of with political representation. And of course, and unfortunately, it's also linked to a crisis of alternatives. What do we say to this entire mess? And I think the problem is much broader, much deeper, that it could be solved with technical answers. So we are in a situation that the ecological question determines all social conflicts, and every social debate on wages, social infrastructure, and so on is also a debate about the social metabolism with nature. And every debate about our metabolism with nature is also one about the organization of our society. So we have a huge societal and political challenge. How do we close the gigantic gap between the urgent measures and the broad awareness, consciousness of the working population, of the situation and what needs to be done? How do we contribute to the working population, the workers gaining awareness of their own possibilities of action and shaping the situation. Leszek already mentioned the different scenarios of the IPCC, and if the policies the governments promised will be really implemented, what's by no means sure, we will enter into a more or less 3.5 degree Earth system. Yeah, that will mean that we will step over different kinds of tipping points of the Earth system. So that the mainstream policies that are planned or scheduled are by no means a solution of the problems. They will increase the problem. So this will be likely a scenario in this direction. If we follow for instance, the prognosis of the OPEC or the International Energy Organization, we will even face, we will go on in a massive continuation of the global warming situation. So in the prognosis of the OPEC, for instance, oil will remain a major energy source. Today, it's about 30%. They say that in 2045, it will be still at about 28%. And that's that's linked, of course. The major problem is the growth economy. It's the pressure, the constraint of the capitalist growth. That's the major issue. That will increase the material throughput of our society, of our economy, and that will lead us in a situation, in a scenario on 3 or even more degree global warming corresponding to the IPCC scenarios. So that's the broad context. Now I skip to the current situation in Germany. And this is very linked to, of course, the energy question and the gas question and the strategic alliance. Some parts of German capital have been engaged with fossil industries in Russia. Here you see the price development of electricity. But what's obvious that the price increases of electricity already started before the war. That's a very important statement because many people, right-wing currents, but even left-wing currents in Germany say the whole mess is a product of the sanctions against Russia. Here we see the export volume of Russian gas to different countries, and you see clearly that Germany, of course, was a major buyer of Russian gas. The natural gas consumption in Germany in the previous 30 years increased. Here you see the situation. If you have a closer look, we see that even in specific industries, it increased even more. And Russia was the most important provider for gas for the German economy. So here you see the price development in the previous years of gas. And of course, this is linked to the war, but not only. Already before the war started, the price of energy, also of gas, increased. Here you see the composition of consumption of gas, and that's very important to understand the German conflicts or within Germany. Of course, we have a broad, of the right-hand side, you see the household part, and on the left-hand side, you see the industrial part. And there is even one part where gas is needed for the industrial processes, not just for heating, but for the the material industrial processes. So that's a key. It's a strategic important issue. So I cannot go deeper into these issues, but my major argument is that there has been a long-standing, far-reaching strategic alliance between parts of the German capital with Gazprom and the Russian fossil capital. We could discuss this later, but that's a major, and this partially explains, I only say partially explains, the German political debates. What's going on right now? There's, of course, people are suffering from the increase of energy prices, and there are different mobilizations going on, or different alliances have been formed. One is called Heating Bread Freedom. You remember the Russian Revolution. They argue hardly against sanctions, for price caps, and some of their exponents are even in favor of reopening Nord Stream. They argue for peace talks with Russia, and some of them openly defend some kind of Russian position. There's another alliance. It's a copy from the British or the UK campaign, Enough is Enough. There are people linked to the journal Jacobin. They just copy the British campaign into the German context. They say nothing about the war. They say nothing about ecology. They just focus on price gaps, public-private, on public payments. Sorry, this is not private, and social demands. There is a broader alliance that had been formed. They organize right today, in this day, broad demonstrations from labor unions, environmental organizations, and interestingly, their demands are quite moderate, but they include an environmental dimension, and they even include some, in a broad sense of the word, solidarity with Ukraine. And of course, there are many local alliances. But what's now a current, I would say, eco-socialist orientation. And this eco-socialist orientation has to bring together three pillars, which are equally important. We have to go, the starting point are the planetary boundaries, the tipping points, and the need for radical ecological conversions. We have to combine this, of course, with the social struggles I just mentioned, and we combine with the transnational and global solidarity and convergence. I think it's very concrete in the current debates. Of course, it's important to defend wages. So in the sense of a classical demand, a retrospective automatic cost of living adjustment. In Italian, it's called scala mobile. However, this demand is also problematic if the composition of consumption is not challenged. So we have to think on both dimensions. Of course, price gaps are important, but they need to be carefully designed in order to prevent that they are just subsidies for industries. And also, I think what already in UK is happening, don't pay campaigns and these kinds of sorts can help to improve the degree of self-organization. But then, and here I'm quite close to Simon, I think a key orientation is to extend the social infrastructure. That's really a strategic key demand. So cheap provision of basic energy, but linked with the progressive higher prices for higher consumption, extending public health care in the broadest sense of the word, education, public transport, including health insurances, social insurances, housing. So the perspective, a city of short distances. Why it is important? Because it's possible to combine different issues, to reduce energy consumption. And I'm strict on that. We have to reduce in absolute terms, in absolute figure, the energy consumption. That we cannot find just technological solutions. We have to push back the commodity logic, and we have to promote self-organizations in the society. A major precondition or accompanying perspective of that is, of course, the industrial conversion. We need to convert and partially or even largely dismantle industries like the car industry. And electric cars are not an alternative. They are highly resource consumption. They are not ecological. They consume all kinds of resources, and this has to be linked with campaigns for what I call democratic social appropriation. So socialization of the entire energy sector. In Germany, there's an interesting campaign more linked, launched by the climate movement, RWE enteignen, so this appropriate RWE, it's one major energy transnational. And this has to be combined with this perspective of conversion. And I think that's a key issue. Now, I think really we have to discuss how energy consumption and material throughput in the broad sense can be reduced, mostly in the early industrialized, I call imperialist countries. That's not a recipe for other countries. So I'm strict on that. That's our job in our rich countries. And the third point, and here I end, it's of course the global perspective of global solidarity. What does it mean? The societies of the early industrialized countries have a much higher responsibility for the emission of greenhouse gases than the entire rest of the world. So they need reduce much more quickly and much more extensively the greenhouse gases. We need to introduce the question of compensation and payment of ecological debt towards the global south, and even probably also to some Eastern European countries. In a very concrete and current situation, we have to combine this with some kind of demand that no payment for Putin's war, so that's strict, so no provision of oil, of gas and so on from Russia. That's highly contradictory in Germany, for instance, or even in other countries. And probably this is linked to what Maryna and Simon already have introduced. How do we combine solidarity relations in the perspective of reconstruction of Ukraine? How we in Switzerland and Austria and Germany and France and UK can exert pressure on companies, on transnationals, on governments to influence and to shape their investment behavior in Ukraine or even in other countries. So how can we create direct linkages from movements in our countries with unions, with environmental movement in Ukraine, for instance, linked to the hydrogen question that Simon already mentioned, and how can we develop some kind of broader international, transnational perspective of a real radical socio-ecological transition. But of course, the challenge is how to do it concretely. How can we combine the different levels of broader, of long-term perspectives with very actual daily demands on the street in campaigns?
Дякую, Крістіан. Так, за...
Thank you, Christian, for this great speech. And I think you got this general framework that eco-social movements can provide. You gave us the vision. Okay, it had so many measures about the crisis. You explained that the crisis began before the war. Yes, but I think it's great that you were able to underline that we have no alternative, because quite often we need to speak about some tactical questions, how to make slight improvements instead of speaking about major alternative. At the moment, today in Ukraine, it's very difficult, but we attempt to. I thought that we should start our discussion from the question about these levels that you have spoken about. So Christian and Maryna, a question to you. Maybe somebody else would be eager to comment. So Christian, you told us that we need to radically decrease our consumption, but in Ukraine, it's not so obvious for us because Ukraine and our counterparts from Global South that follow us on Zoom, first of all, we would like to be able to consume as much as Europe does. So we have a question. I don't want to moralize a lot, but still, in what way can we adapt these requirements of green course that Maryna has spoken about? And should we make a note that Ukraine has some different conditions? Who would be able then to compensate these different conditions of transition? That is, we have degrowth in different conditions. We have a different starting point. So Christian, could you say a few words about that? Please stick to agenda, 5 minutes only. A floor to you, Christian.
Okay, thank you very much for this question. Of course, I completely agree. My arguments are valid for the early industrialized imperialist countries. So that's our responsibility. I'm born in a very rich country in Switzerland, so that's our responsibility. So to be clear, I do not argue that some kind of degrowth perspective is valid for poor countries, and even, of course, not for Ukraine. That's to be clear. And I even argue that our societies have some kind of responsibility to compensate our ecological debts towards the rest of the world. And this can have different concrete expressions. For instance, of course, now we have a debate on the debts, on the economic debts of the Ukraine. And I think it's our responsibility in the rich countries to launch campaigns that the debts of Ukraine, for instance, are annihilated. That's one of the questions. The other idea is that but that's difficult. We have to think about how the financial sector in our countries, the industrial sector, is engaged in strategies to extract value from other countries, including Ukraine, of course, this in the context of reconstruction. Then we have to think about how we can make this campaigns or make it as a political issue. And this is linked to what Simon already addressed. If the goal of the EU, for instance, is to make Ukraine, because of the huge surface, as a cheap provider of energy or hydrogen production, of course, we have to be against, or at least to raise the question of the conditions of that. So in order to argue against this all kinds of old and new forms of extractivism. But this kind of degrowth, I do not use the word degrowth often, because I want to make it more concrete. We have to convert and dismantle the automotive industry, and so on and so on. And also the dismantling of the armaments industry, as Leszek already mentioned, is of course it's a highly complicated issue in the current situation, but it needs to be addressed on an international scale. So that's the problem, is that we have to think different dimensions together. But I focus that on our responsibility. Yeah?
Дякую. Це, я не мав на увазі про те, що
Thank you. I didn't really mean that we do understand that the left perspective, the positions you are taking is actually one of supporting the people mentioned by me, like people in Ukraine, for instance. I wanted to talk about how we could compensate or adjust this. Maybe Maryna would like to add something about implementing, for example, the principles and requirements of the EU in Ukraine. Are there any plans? Are there any thoughts on how those could be adapted in order to be realized in Ukrainian post-war context? Yes, and I would like to touch upon the question you addressed the question a bit very briefly. So I think it's an interesting situation regarding Ukraine. When we talk about the global climate responsibilities, Ukraine is considered to be one of the countries that is supposed to be a responsible party within different conventions on climate change. Ukraine, together with the Western countries, is a post-war country which developed quite quickly industrially, and so is responsible for a huge number of emissions during its industrial development. So as a country like that, Ukraine was a country which, for example, with the Kyoto Protocol and other conventions, took upon itself some responsibilities, unlike some other countries of the global south. So it's an interesting question, which I think should be now analyzed from a different point of view, however, because the situation in the 90s, when the Framework Convention was adopted, and then there were those discussions on which country bears what kind of historical responsibility. If we look at the 90s, now the situation is very different. First of all, Ukraine decreased the carbon emissions in the 1990s. That was because the level of industrial production or industrial activity went down. The same happened also after 2015 because of the war in the Donbass. So from the point of view of responsibility, if we look at the question of the climate change, climate crisis seriously, I would say it does not make sense to present it as the victory of Ukraine. It's not something that happened because of a comprehensive plan that Ukraine was pursuing with regard to climate change to decrease the emissions. But anyway, that's the fact that the CO2 emissions decreased compared to the 1990s, I would say by some 60%, and even when we look at the last climate plan, which is now presented every 5 years, we adopted this goal, which is a minimal goal, but still this is something that we're working towards. We have decreased the carbon emissions because simply of the industrialization. And then this is the first time after that when we took upon ourselves to achieve this minimal goal in carbon emissions. So I would say we need to look at the situation from a different perspective and telling people during the war that we need to cut carbon emissions. And this should be our priority. This is not really the right approach from the strategic perspective. Decreasing emissions can be done not through limiting the consumption or blackouts 5 hours a day, etc. I would say this can be done by adopting a more reasonable policy. Let's say the mass-scale implementation of energy efficiency measures in construction, transport sectors. Transport, for example, in Ukraine, to decarbonize it, you need a lot, but also it has a huge potential of decarbonization. So reforming the municipal transport and then getting rid of traffic jams and then thinking about how we develop the road network in Ukraine, and instead of developing, for example, highways, focusing on developing railway infrastructure could be a possibility. And as we know, at the start of the war, for example, there were problems with fuel, gas, and so, for instance, e-transport in cities became an important resource for transporting people. So this is a possibility for cutting our carbon emissions, and this could be something that's presented for the population in a different way. People would see these measures as something that they can readily embrace. We need to expand, we need to develop the social infrastructure, and in this way, at the same time, we could cut carbon emissions. So that should be our perspective instead of talking about the historical responsibility of Ukraine as a post-Soviet state or economy in transition is something else. I would say that after the war, addressing these questions in the old way would be really a regressive step. Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Maryna, once again. So my conclusion would be we need to, there are quite a lot of instruments we could implement. We need to think about alternatives that actually exist in Ukraine right now. And then there is the European experience we can also rely on. Yeah, I don't like this approach, which unfortunately is also widespread in Ukraine, the approach within which we talk about historical responsibility of Ukraine, because after all, we can look at who contaminated the planet, polluted the planet most of all, and then pass the buck on to them. I would say that we need to think about new solutions to change what is polluting the planet right now, without taking into account whether Ukraine is a highly developed industrialized country or not, because otherwise that's the burden which we will have to still shoulder even in the circumstances when our economy is growing. So we need to think about some kind of global solutions, not based on moralizing about past responsibility, but would rely on social economic policies of the future, balanced policies. And another question that I have, I would say it's a bit provocative. It's a question for Simon. I read some of your articles, and then you also talked about this today. Ukraine has to no longer rely on Russian gas. We stopped importing gas from Russia already, but on paper, nothing has changed. Ukraine used the gas that it didn't have, and we still do it, but on paper, it looks like we're paying other countries. But in fact, this is not what actually happens. We would like all of us to reduce our dependency on Russian gas. But then would it be possible for us to do that in a year or 2 or 5? It's not something that is realistic in terms of the development of renewable sources of energy. And then if we take this logic to the extreme, what will happen to the population of Ukraine? Let's say we stop using the gas from the pipe that Russia uses to supply to Europe. We no longer rely on that. How do we present it to the population? What happens with the population? So which mechanisms do you see here as possible, perhaps? Because of course we need to fight back against Russian imperialism and oil and gas as its instruments, but how could Europe perhaps support Ukraine in this? Maybe you can tell us something about the electricity, the energy and its supply to Ukraine. What can be done realistically in this situation when we cannot really refuse, no longer use Russian gas, and the war is ongoing. So Simon, is there something you could tell us about that?
Thank you. Yes, so first point is that we need to divide up our understanding into short term, medium term, long term. Short term, of course, all the housing in Ukraine and the district heating systems, the combined heat and power plants, many of these rely on gas. So, of course, Ukraine needs gas, but Ukraine produces 20 billion cubic meters a year. For the most urgent consumption, this is enough. I suppose that figure will have gone down this year because of wartime. I do not know how much, but Ukraine has a lot of its own gas with which it can supply these most urgent needs. You're right that Ukraine buys gas from traders in Europe. Actually, those molecules of gas originally come from Siberia. But this is another 10 billion cubic meters. It will be more expensive this year. That's also a problem. So that's in the short term. In the medium term and the long term, Ukraine can make massive savings in the amount of gas it uses by making the housing stock use energy more efficiently. These big housing estates where many Ukrainians live, which were built in the 1960s and 70s, at that time, this was great technology. Now it's not great technology, and also it's 50, 60 years old. So the concentration should be on renewing that housing stock, making it, I mean, today to build a house which is zero carbon, it's simple. That's what architects learn in the first year in university. It's more difficult to retrofit an old house, but it's also possible. So we can cut, and this goes back to the point about energy demand. As socialists in the labor movement, let us not talk about cutting demand. It sounds as though we want everybody to go in the winter without heat. That's not what we want. What we want is for everybody to live in a house where the heat does not go out through the window. That's what we want. And also that the heat should be provided by a heat pump. In energy terms, a heat pump is 4 or 5 times more efficient than a gas boiler. 4 or 5 times more efficient. Those heat pumps have to be distributed. The engineers have to learn how to use them. And this will reduce the amount of gas that Ukraine needs very, very substantially. Let me make one final point, Alexander, which is to respond to your point that you made earlier. You said I made 4 demands. Actually, let's clarify. I understand that each of the 4 things I talked about, for example, getting energy from renewables, I mean, that's not a demand. I'm not demanding that from anybody because no one person can do that. That's an approach, a way of looking at the problem. And I understand that these problems are very, very complicated. And so I don't want to say, I am not demanding that Ukraine does not build Khmelnytsky 3 and 4, but I am asking the labor movement in Ukraine. Already we have an energy minister, Kalushenko, who loves nuclear. We have a powerful nuclear lobby that loves nuclear. Okay, let those guys demand. We should demand energy efficient homes. We should demand renewables. We should demand energy as a right, as a service, not as a commodity. These are things that, as you said, Alexander, the labor movement now in Ukraine is not strong. but it can start to demand these things. And of course, we try in the labor movement, those of us in the labor movement in Europe, we will also shout about these things as loud as we can and shout against stupid schemes to export hydrogen.
Дякую вам. Я думаю, це дуже важливо в Україні, принаймні на такому медійному рівні.
Okay, I think it's really important, at least at the media level, to change the current discourse, and it's really inspiring. It makes us work harder. This is what motivates us to have discussions, to publish articles, because we've been for a long time in Ukraine under some kind of copying foreign practices. We were under this impact of old neoliberal approach, like we will allow everybody to build whatever they want, and people will build renewable electric stations in Ukraine, and will get cheap electricity. No, it's not that simple. Some political decisions should be taken, and Maryna has told us that various shift to renewables might take place. For example, we might export not just some grain, but clean energy, and still we may not decarbonize us completely. So we'll be promoting our own vision, and I'll hope it will change our energy policy. So, Mr. Leszek, I have a question to you. So my question is as follows. In continuation with the previous concept, let's imagine that some point of view will lead, and we will be building new, very safe nuclear power stations, but supply and control of construction and power import from Ukraine, power export from Ukraine, it will not go to Ukrainian society, so Ukrainians will not profit from them. Won't it be a new type of neo-colonial dependency? So, one more question. Just recently, it was kind of a on the table question, an urgent question. What about used nuclear fuel? Because you need to store it somewhere, and can it happen that way that everybody will transport it to Ukraine, and so Ukraine will be a trash place for old, for nuclear fuel storage? So these are my two questions. And one more question: what about the way nuclear power stations can be prolonged? That is, many nuclear power stations are outdated, and many people say they should be closed right now. But we can hear that the time of functioning might be prolonged. What does international science say about this? So 3 questions to you, Mr. Leszek. Please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. So first, I think that what Ukraine needs and generally Europe needs are strong labor movement in the energy sector to ensure that no neo-colonial extraction takes place. And as a rule, if you have highly qualified and difficult to replace workers who are coming to a single place, like a nuclear power plant, it's easier to unionize them than when you have solar panel installers, which is a simple job and easier to replace a single worker, working all over the country and not meeting in one place. And we also need EU-wide labor movement solidarity, probably also expressed during the process of Ukraine joining the European Union, because right now your newest law makes it very easy to fire workers and is generally anti-labor, and this law will have to be rescinded after the war ends. Just the EU has to require that, sorry, you just passed this extremely neoliberal law, it was for war, okay, but now the war is over and you need European labor standards. This is extremely important. As for nuclear fuel, there are IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency regulations on transporting spent nuclear fuel and so on. And the IAEA are the guys who went to the Zaporozhye plant to check what the Russians are doing there. So they're pretty devoted to their job, I'd say. And basically, it makes no sense to transport nuclear fuel, spent nuclear fuel to Ukraine, because spent nuclear fuel can be reprocessed, but the reprocessing is done since it has an increased risk of generating nuclear material that could be used in weapons. It is done in countries that already have nuclear weapons because they have procedures to control it. So they have, like France, for example, reprocesses nuclear fuel. And also, I would like to again, to just refer to what Christian was saying earlier, that I agree in 100% that we need a degrowth, but we need to do, again, Ukraine is not capable of introducing degrowth on its own. It's a really, in effect, colonialized country. I really recommend to anybody who has not read it, Less is More by Jason Hickel, which really nicely explains the principle of degrowth. And it explains that rich countries have to decrease their consumption, while countries that were victims of colonialism have to develop. Development is not growth, but they have to build their industries like low carbon energy, energy efficient housing, public transit, and so on. And we have to keep in mind, it is like not commonly thought about it this way, but Ukraine was a victim of colonialism of Russia. Ukraine was drained of resources by Russia. So it's not really that Ukraine was a developed country that built stuff for its own purpose. They built stuff for the USSR, and then this stuff traveled to other places. And one more thing that I would like to point out, that there are really, in reference to Simon's presentation, that there are no inherently socialistic or inherently democratic technologies, because I do a lot of translations for the energy sector, and I translated things related to wind power, I translated things related to solar power, to coal, to gas, to energy storage, and to energy transmissions. And the customer were all the same international corporations. So we really need to control these corporations and to change our system. But before we change our system, we still need to build the stuff that we need to transform the system, like Maryna said, low carbon energy, energy efficient housing, public transit. So yeah, thanks.
Дякую, Leszek.
Thank you,
Thank
Mr.
you,
Leszek.
It's really very important what you said at the end. It's something that's very important for Ukraine, to understand the technological solutions on their own cannot change the the living conditions of people. Those technological solutions have to have underlying political will, political decisions in order to guide the technological solutions into the right direction in order to help people. So yes, let's hope that movements championing such causes will appear in Ukraine, and that Ukrainian resistance will mean that people also vocally are ready to defend their rights and interests in peace time. And I think we have some questions on Zoom from our attendees. So let's give people the opportunity to ask those questions. But I would like to remind everyone to skip to the time limit, because we are quickly approaching our end of discussion. So Rachel, if you'd like to ask, please turn your mic on and ask the question.
Can you hear me? Okay. Goodness. Can you hear me? Oh no. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh,
Please.
okay. Sorry. I wasn't sure. Just about kind of, I mean, as everyone seems to know so much about this war, and above that has been about Russia's energy dominance in Europe and the world. And as that is going away for political and ecological and so many other necessary reasons, I think they are not going to take it too well. We're already seeing some strong mask-off moments, and thinking about what we can possibly expect in terms of on communication and, I don't know. I mean, I get very annoyed by people who cynically worry about the nuclear button saber rattling, which is more often than not true cynicism of people who had that kind of ulterior motives, but just about what we can possibly expect to what we can see from Russia in terms of what it will say and what it will do as it leaves the realm of being a behemoth of the energy sector on a global scale.
Дякую, Ричард. Можливо, хтось.
Thank you, Rachel. Maybe one of our panelists would like to try and answer that question. So Russia's actions reflected on local level, what can be done about this situation? Simon, the floor is yours.
Well, I cannot answer all the issues you have mentioned, but I think one thing that's very important to notice and to think about is that Russia has an oil export business, which it relies on. It is trying very hard to maintain its oil output while the sanctions take effect. These sanctions are not very efficient. The Western countries do not want to stop Russia from exporting oil. They want to make it look as though they are doing something, while the oil now goes mostly to Asia. In the case of gas, I think something different is happening and very interesting, which is that the gas business built up mainly between Russia and Germany over 40 years is now being destroyed by the Kremlin. The Kremlin is telling Gazprom to reduce the level of gas export to Europe. Christian showed us some graphs about this. They are destroying their own business. Economically, this is crazy. What it shows is that in Russian policy, it has become more important to wage this war against Ukraine. It has become more important to promote militarism and imperialism, more important than to make money from the gas business to Europe, which was a big thing for Russia during the whole post-Soviet period. And I think this is something to think about. This is a stage in the degeneration of the Russian Empire.
Дякую. Значить, технічно ми збираємо ще ось.
Thank you. So at the technical moment, we are gathering questions, collecting questions from our listeners, and then we have a question to Leszek from Fabian. When you talk about the independence of people who have nuclear weapons, is that the case? Is nuclear really a solution to be independent of energy supplies from Russia? And especially as Rosatom is one of the biggest global players when it comes to nuclear power. And I can answer that Ukraine shifted to other resources, but still we have some kind of dependency here. And maybe this is a kind of distorted view on the situation in Russia. Will have still the nuclear sector, and then the Rosatom is becoming one of the most dominant players in the world. So Leszek, what do you think about this? A minute or two, perhaps.
Okay, so when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, because that's when the war started, Ukraine started the process of switching its nuclear power fuel supplies from Rosatom to Westinghouse, and this process is now finished. So now new Ukrainian atomic fuel will come from the US. Russia's nuclear fuel exports are responsible for a very, very small fraction of Russian income, unlike fossil fuel exports, because a single nuclear power plant uses one train car of fuel per year, and a single coal plant uses one train of fuel per day. So it's an enormous difference. And Russian VVER 1000 nuclear reactors are a very modern and effective technology, but they are now operated by Ukrainian operators and by a Ukrainian company, Energoatom. And if Ukraine builds new power plants, they will be American AP1000 Westinghouse plants. Generally, with nuclear power plants, if you have a power plant on your territory, you can get supplies from fuel supplies from many countries. You can get them from France, you can get them from the US, and you can get them from Russia if you want, but obviously we don't want it. And in case of a gas power plant, you're much more dependent on the supplies of fuel. So nuclear provides more energy security because it's easier to stockpile a few years worth of fuel. Thank you. That's the end.
Дякую. Марина ще останнє, да, додасть.
And then a remark from Maryna, I'm guessing. I'd like to very briefly address the question about nuclear energy and about the dependency on Russia in this question. I'd like to point out that before 2021, Ukraine paid Russia for the storage of nuclear waste, even after the start of the war in Donbass, and paid quite big sums of money for this. This has been only stopped recently, and there is this centralized storage on the premises of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant where the nuclear waste is taken. But this shift only occurred recently, so we need to bear that in mind. It's not something that is well known, that is on the surface, but this is still a relevant issue. And then I'd like to point out that in all the debates about nuclear energy, I'd like to point out that the whole process of design and construction of nuclear power plants takes a lot of time, decades basically, and this is a problem when we look especially in the Ukrainian situation at the fact that the infrastructure is suffering. This is the scenario which is not really going to work. There are many examples, Finland to China, of nuclear power plants being built. So from planning to operation, perhaps 10 years, perhaps 15 years pass. So 10, 15 years between the moment when the power plant is designed and starts operating. So in the case of Khmelnytsk power plant, we had the same situation. The planning started still in the Soviet Union, and then right now we are still talking about people working on the designs for the power plant's operation. So this is the general situation, and then there is Ukrainian situation, this particular current situation we're in. I would say that nuclear energy is not really very reliable in this context. Maryna, thank you. And I know we have some questions in Zoom. I'd like to apologize to those people who are submitting their questions right now. Unfortunately, we have a time limit here. So I would like to ask our participants this last generalizing question. What do you think about these steps, the measures that Ukraine could take one by one? Which questions would you suggest for Ukrainian actors in this situation, Ukrainian government, social movements perhaps, and what can be done globally by international players in order to lessen the energy dependencies, what needs to be changed in Ukraine and what needs to be changed on the international level in order to achieve the priorities you were talking about. So a minute or two for your responses. In which order would you like to go? It's up to you.
Then I start. So as for the first question, I agree with the thoughts by Christian and Simon as for development of social infrastructure in Ukraine, especially in the after-war recovery, and not to consider the social economic infrastructure as a separate thing from the green recovery, because quite often these two notions are being juxtaposed. They are the same thing. That's the first thing I want to say. And then in the Ukrainian context, following the Ukrainian regulations, which are different from the European regulations, we need to focus on transparency of the regulation authority, because everything that is controlled by the government isn't quite often working for the sake of population, for the benefit of population. There are lots of various schemes that are being implemented in the Ukrainian energy sector. Quite often, those were implemented first with the neoliberalized energy market, and some Ukrainian energy companies got special purpose role, so they actually delivered cheap electricity to the household, while private detect company of oligarch Akhmetov sold electricity at higher price. That's why we need transparency for the regulator for the benefit of general population. Then we need to engage representatives of local communities and NGOs. Not just the government should develop a master plan of recovery, because local communities know better what was the damage and what infrastructure needs to be recovered first and foremost. These are the primary solutions, like local plans for recovery at the community or regional level, not just one master plan by the government. As of international level, then we should speak. We need the support by the progressive forces, those that would underline the state of Ukraine, those that would engage in discussions as of green transition, energy transition, and socio-economic transition as being very important for Ukraine in its recovery. This is actual necessity, also in the context of European integration. Not only climatic environmental obligations, not only decrease of carbon emissions, but also implementation of proper labor legislation and treatment of it as being something important. Sorry, Maryna, just answer one question, because we don't have much time, so somebody else who wants to speak. So Simon, floor is yours.
Thank you. Very, very quickly, Maryna has already said a lot. I agree with her that we must challenge the whole idea of electricity being provided through these market, this market framework. And as I said before, I think let's take up the labor movement demand, very old demand for electricity and energy as a right. I think about workers, Leszek mentioned this before. I think we should support organization both by highly skilled nuclear workers and also by workers who are installing solar panels or mending gas pipelines that have been bombed by Putin or whatever. All these workers deserve our support and should be invited into our conversations about the future of the energy system. I think a third point, very important, is the transition away from coal and this discussion in Donbass. I think this is a very hopeful moment in this terrible days that Donbass is going through, that people are now thinking about the future without coal. This is, to me, very heartening. And also let us here, let's continue our conversation with email, with whatever, between ourselves to work out socialist answers to all these difficult problems.
Дякую, Leszek.
Okay,
thank you, Leszek.
I fully agree that electricity should be decommodified because the long-time obsession of the European Commission with markets everywhere and energy markets is one of the things that have led to this energy crisis. In the same manner, emissions trading schemes are also a problem. I mean, we should replace ETS, which is an emission trading scheme which lends itself to speculation, with a simple carbon tax that increases with time. And we should demand more labor union power, and labor unions should cooperate within the whole Europe. So during the EU accession process of Ukraine. And these labor unions should demand green transition. And I really think that stricter integration of Ukraine with EU-wide energy grid would be helpful here if we increase the amount of renewables in the grid, because it works both ways. Both Ukraine can help Europe when it has high renewables generation and Europe doesn't, and the other way around. When Europe has a lot of renewables generation and Ukraine does it, then energy flows can flow from EU from the rest of Europe to Ukraine. And at the end, I would like also to mention that energy workers of Ukraine working under the current conditions of war are very important heroes for current Ukraine state, and Heroyam Slava. Thank you.
Дякую. Christian?
Christian, would you like to comment briefly?
Very shortly, I 100% agree with Simon on this whole issue of social infrastructure in a broad sense of the word. Leszek also mentioned this. I think this could be even a unified perspective, and where we can combine different scales of action on a very local level, even in the boroughs of cities. We can combine it at the national scale and even with the transnational scale, always with the same approach. So and we have to think about how we can develop it creatively and together. I do not agree with Leszek on the nuclear power issue. I think one comrade in the Q&A already mentioned that even if the natural conditions change, we saw it this year in France. France was not able to cool its power stations. They had to switch off 50% of the entire nuclear power stations. So we came to a very paradoxical situation that Germany now delivered electricity to France coming from renewables and bought French gas coming from I don't know where. So it's a strange situation. What we have to think more about is how we can combine our perspective, how we can upscale our perspectives, even on a short-term frame. So how we can combine this entire question of social appropriation, of socialization, even on a European scale. That I do not have an answer, but we come to this question on transportation, on energy, on lots of things. perspective, can we raise the question of some kind of public ownership on a European scale? It's not only local or the national, it can be upscaled, but that's an open question. We have to think about.
Дякую всім за цікаву дискусію.
Thank you everyone for this exciting discussion. So several times people talked today about nuclear energy. Yesterday, actually, when we discussed the labor rights during one of the events of our conference, we talked about the example of the labor trade union of people working in the nuclear sector, where actually there are many activists and they have had many successes in protecting labor rights in the nuclear sector energy, even during the war. And then thank you everyone for starting this discussion today. I hope that we will be able to spread the word and to continue this discussion by publications and other meetings. And I hope that we will be able short term to come to the understanding of which alternatives we could put forward. And in an hour, we are starting a discussion on housing and accommodation and the reconstruction of damaged or ruined buildings in Ukraine. And then tomorrow, during the last day of our conference, we'll focus more on military questions, on the participation of Ukrainian left activists in the war, and how we could change the global security system in order for it not to depend on the factors that define it today. So thank you, everyone, and we hope we'll continue this discussion later.